Good evening. Welcome to Sparks of the Parsha, Parsha Tidbits. I'm trying to get a little bit of a insight to some of the teachings of the Parsha in capsule form. The name of the Parsha this week is Balak. Balak is the name of a king of Moab. Jews were approaching that country on the way to Israel, and he was terrified that the Jews were going to conquer his country, just as they had conquered the land of Sichon and the land of Og, two mighty kings, and they were easily defeated. So, of course, it was only natural for the Moabites to fear the Jews. So what does Balak do? He hires Bilam. He hires a prophet known for his ability to curse. Now, let's try to understand what's going on over here. Throughout history, when you're threatened with warfare, you prepare your armies. But Balak knew that they could not defeat the Jews. He heard the stories of the defeat of his protectors. Sichon and Og, two mighty kings, were there to protect Moab, and they were defeated handily. So he investigated with the Midianites, and he said, your country is where the Jewish people's leader comes from. Moses was from Midian. After he fled Egypt, he lived in Midian. He married a daughter of the priest of Midian. So what is the power of the Jewish people? And their answer was, the power is their mouth. They have the power to speak to God, and with their prayers, they are able to accomplish anything. Well, if that's the case, we're not going to try to defeat them on the battlefield. We'll hire someone who also has the power to use his mouth to curse. Bilam was known for his prophetic powers. Now here's a little bit of a question, a little bit of a problem. A prophet, it doesn't say he was a wizard, he was a magician, he was a sorcerer. He was a prophet. And in fact, according to one opinion in the Midrash, his power of prophecy rivaled that of Moses. So this was an incredibly powerful spiritual person, and not through occult powers, but God speaks to him, as we read in this week's Torah portion. How could it be that a vile man like Bilam, how do we know he was vile? Because he was trying to curse the Jews, and God had to transform and convert his curses into blessings. But had that not been done, these curses would have been horrible. And yet, God spoke to him. He was a prophet. So the Midrash says that God did it to prevent the nations of the world from using the excuse that if they had been given prophets like the Jews had been given, Moses, Joshua, and others, they too would have been much better. They would have behaved much more morally and ethically. But because they had no holy men, they had no prophets, then what could you expect? So to dispel that argument, that defense, God says, you know what, I'll give you a prophet who'll be equal to Moses in terms of his prophetic powers, and let's see if that would make a difference. That's the answer given in the Midrash. But the question is asked, but God gave them a prophet who was only great in his prophecy, in his prophetic powers, but he was a vile, immoral person. So what good does that do, having a prophet who's not one who could teach them morality? We had a Moses. Moses was not just a great prophet, he was the man through whom God transmitted the ultimate teachings of the Torah, how to be a good person, how to lead a just, moral, and godly life. Bilam was the very antithesis of that. So they could still have the argument, God, you didn't give us a righteous leader. So the answer was given by one of the Hasidic masters, Simcha Bunin of Pshischa. He was ailing, problems with his eyes. So he went to some large city, to Berlin, I believe, to be treated. And some people said to him, you know what, there's a guy who deals with the cult, he's a magician, he's he uses all sorts of alternative methods, let's put it that way, to heal people, supernatural methods, and he's known to be very good. Why don't you go to him? So Reb Simcha Bunim said like this: if I was interested in going to extra natural, supernatural ways of healing my ailment, I would have gone to the great tzaddikim, the very righteous and holy people of our generation. But the Torah says that when you're ill, you have a problem, medical problem, you should go to the doctor. So that's why I'm going to the doctors. But if you're telling me I should go to be treated with alternative methods, there's a Jewish, Torah-sanctioned alternative method, which is going to holy people, righteous people. Well, that he used as an analogy. The analogy is, when God gave the nations of the world people who had prophetic powers, supernatural powers, and they availed themselves of these people's talents, that raises a question. If you already believe in the occult, if you already believe in the supernatural, why don't you go to the real source of the supernatural? Why don't you go to God? Why don't you go to Moses? Why don't you go to the sources of spirituality that goes together with morality? And it's interesting, I once heard someone make this comment, that there are people who say, well, I don't believe in this, I don't believe in that. They call themselves agnostics or atheists. And yet, the first thing they'll do when they open the newspaper is to look at the horoscope. In other words, if you're already looking at non-rational ways of dealing with your life, your health, then you have no excuse. Why aren't you going to the real source? At any rate, Balak hired Bilam to curse the Jews, and it doesn't work. Every time he made an attempt to curse them, blessings came out of his mouth. In fact, some of the most beautiful, some of the most exquisitely beautiful blessings came out of the vile mouth of Balak, including, and we'll focus on a few. One of them is Matovu, Ohalecha Yaakov, how goodly are your tents, O Jacob, Mishkenosecha Yisrael, your dwelling places, O Israel. This is a prayer that we say every morning. People say it when they enter the synagogue. It's a beautiful, beautiful prayer. What inspired him to say that? Actually, what he meant to say is, may all the synagogues and all the holy places and all the Jewish homes be destroyed. But God turned it all around to talk about the beauty of the Jewish home and the Jewish holy places. So according to the Talmud, what inspired Bilam to say these words? He saw something unique about Jewish homes. Now you have to remember, the Jews in the desert were pitching their tents. You had 600,000 men over the age of 20. You had thousands, hundreds of thousands, all squeezed into a relatively small area. And he noticed that when they pitched their tents, no one ever pitched their entrances opposite the entrance of the other person's tent, so that they should never look to see what is going on in another person's home. This, what is called tznius, this modesty, this respect for a person's privacy, the integrity of a person's private home, was what inspired him. He was amazed at the degree to which Jews went out of their way to protect the privacy of others. You know, one of the weaknesses that humans have is the voyeuristic tendency to try to see what's going on in another person's home, in another person's car, in another person's shopping cart. People have to see what the other is doing. That is something that the Jews did not have, that weakness they did not possess. And that's what inspired him. Perhaps he wanted to curse them because of this, because he couldn't stand that beauty of the Jewish home, but instead he came out praising it by saying, how goodly are your tents, O Jacob. That power to not be tempted to look at someone else's life, giving them, not invading their privacy. You know, there's a whole debate whether there's a right of privacy in the Constitution. Well, in the Torah, there is a right of privacy. Actually, it's an obligation to protect another person's privacy. That's one of the most beautiful prayers that came out of his mouth. Another very powerful one at the end of the portion is one about the future. When Maimonides talks about Mashiach, the Messianic age, it will be ushered in by a descendant of King David, who will bring all Jewish people back into the fold, will fight against all the enemies of Israel and be victorious, and then he'll build the temple, and then he will gather all the Jews to the land of Israel. In the middle of that discussion, he establishes that the belief in Mashiach is mentioned in the Torah, and he uses a few verses, a few sources. One of them is Bilam's statement, where he says, and I'll get the exact quote, because it's so powerful and so central to Judaism, that the belief in Mashiach, not just a Messianic age, but in a person, a Jewish leader who will usher in the Messianic age. And I just want to mention parenthetically that I often hear people say, well, Maimonides didn't believe in a personal Mashiach, in a human Mashiach, he just believed in a Messianic age. Nothing could be farther from the truth, because Maimonides says, and I'm quoting more or less verbatim in an English translation, whoever does not believe in him, but whoever does not anticipate his coming, denies the whole Torah and goes against Moses. In other words, if you don't believe in him, in the person Mashiach, who the Rambam identifies what his characteristics are, what his curriculum vitae is, what his resume is, it's like denying the whole Torah. So anyhow, this is in chapter 24, verse 17. And here he says, I shall see him, but not now. I shall look at him, but it is not near. A star has issued from Jacob, and a scepter bearer has risen from Israel. Now, the Rambam, Maimonides, says this is the reference to the future Messianic age that will be ushered in by a star, someone, or a scepter bearer, who will be a leader, who will fight the enemies, as the verses continue to talk about his conquests, and he will usher in the Messianic age. This is the power that will be vested in Mashiach in the future. This is the source, the biblical source to Mashiach in the 5 books of Moses. If you go to the prophetic writings, they are replete with references to Mashiach, especially Isaiah chapter 11. Now, even though this is Bilam's very positive prophecy and prediction that there will be a Messianic age ushered in by Mashiach, you can even see what he really is trying to do to minimize the blessing, because he says, I shall see him, but not now. I shall look at him, but it's not near. Yes, he couldn't deny the fact that a time will come, a Messianic age will come, but he doesn't want it to come soon. He wants to delay it as much as possible, for which we learn that everyone should not just believe that Mashiach will come, but we have to pray and hope and expect and anticipate his coming imminently, that it won't be postponed. In fact, in our prayers every day, 3 times a day, in the weekdays, we say, Ki lishuascha kivinu kol hayom. For your salvation, we hope all day. That means, as commentaries explain, it's not just that every day we hope for his eventual coming, but we hope that his coming will be any time today. We expect it to be imminent. And if that was true when this prayer was composed 2,000 years ago and more, it's certainly true today when all calculations, all predictions, and all signs of Mashiach show and point to the fact that it is imminent. And Maimonides actually writes that any person who says, well, I believe in Mashiach and I'm expecting him to come, but not now, sometime in the distant future, is actually going against the Torah itself. Now, there is a misconception, and I won't belabor this point too much, there's a misconception that people have that Mashiach can only come if certain conditions are met. That is absolutely not true, and it's contrary to the very foundation of Jewish belief. Mashiach's coming can come regardless of what we do. Our efforts can hasten his coming, can accelerate his coming, number one. Our efforts can make his coming a lot more pleasant and peaceful, because Mashiach's coming could happen through wars and pain and suffering, referred to in the Talmud as Chevlei Mashiach, the birth pangs of the Mashiach. Well, if we do good, we will not only hasten his coming, but we will also make the process a very pleasant, smooth, and positive one. A third thing that we can do by our efforts, not that if we don't have those efforts he can't come, is that when we do what we have to do to bring Mashiach, that means we are preparing ourselves and we're ready for it. And that means Mashiach is coming because of us and not in spite of us, because it can happen either way. And when we're prepared for something, it will be much easier for us to digest it, to internalize it, and to be comfortable with the changes in the world that will happen. Question is asked, let's go back to the name of the Parsha, Balak. Balak is the name of a Moabite king who was an evil man. He wanted to destroy the Jewish people. True, he was afraid of his own skin. He wanted to defend his country, but he still was not a very good man. And some people say that he was even worse than Bilam, although there's a debate about that, who was worse. But he certainly was not a righteous man. Why did he deserve that a portion of the Torah should be named after him? Korach, who we just read a few weeks ago, who was a villain, a rebel, nevertheless was a very holy person, very righteous person at first, who made some very bad judgments. And ultimately it says he will be rehabilitated and he will again rate as one of the great leaders of the Jewish people. So we can understand Korach, but why Balak? And there are several answers to this question, but there's one answer that I think has a very important lesson to us. Balak, if you read the whole portion of the Torah, we find offered 42 sacrifices. And the Talmud says that because of that, God rewarded him, that one of his descendants was Ruth. And we know that Ruth was the great-grandmother of King David, who was the ancestor of none other than Mashiach himself. So Balak, because of his gesture of 42 sacrifices, notwithstanding the fact that he was not doing it for pure motives, notwithstanding the fact that he had done so many other terrible things, nevertheless, God says, I don't underestimate and I don't dismiss any gesture that a person does that is positive. I don't care about the motives. Yes, I prefer good motives. I don't care about the rest of a person's life. I respect and admire and reward every gesture that a person makes. And therefore, not only was he rewarded that his descendants would be the ones to bring Mashiach to the world, Mashiach himself, and all of the long line of the Davidic dynasty, I will reward him that a Torah portion will be named after him, to show you that don't ever underestimate what most people would think was a small, insignificant gesture. And the lesson for us is a very powerful one, that we should never put down any effort that is positive, and not worry so much about whether we're sincere, whether we're not sincere, because sincerity can come later. The action cannot be postponed, or else it'll never be done. When Balak tells Bilam about the problem, the Jewish problem, it's always been a Jewish problem, he describes them in this way, Nechisa as ein haaretz. They covered the eye of the earth, which simply means, it's a fancy way of saying, they're so numerous that they occupy the whole earth, as if there's no way you can see underneath them. You don't see the earth, all you see are the Jews. That's in chapter 22, verse 11. Behold, the people coming out of Egypt has covered the surface of the earth. But one Hasidic master said there's a deeper meaning to this. Whether Balak had that in mind or not, that the Torah is conveying this message to us, that many times the anti-Semite looks at the Jews and say, you're covering up the eye of the earth, the vision, the appearance of the earth. You are not a people that are satisfied with superficiality. Yes, Balak was a superficial person. He brought sacrifices that were only intended for his protection, not because he really cared to serve God. But the Jews, they are covering up the eye of the earth, the earthly way of looking at things, the superficiality of the earth. That is something that we cannot tolerate. We live and thrive on superficiality. And if you look at the world today, the world is so much about appearances. It's the media, it's the popularity of movie stars, of athletes, of powerful and rich people, where the virtues that they represent, that people admire, they may have other virtues, but what people admire is the most external, most superficial aspects of those people's personalities. And going back to a theme that was mentioned before about how Balak, or Bilam rather, was impressed by seeing how Jews respected the privacy of others, it's interesting that we're living in an age, the Facebook age, and it's a little bit ironic that I'm saying this while this program is being broadcast on Facebook, but Facebook has many positive features. But the word face has two meanings in Hebrew. Panim. Panim means face, which is surface, superficial, but panim also comes from the word pnimi, that which is internal, that which is beneath the surface, that which is deep and profound. So you can take this medium and other media that can be extremely superficial, invading people's privacy. Nothing is left to an individual's own private life. Everything is out in the open, and sometimes people voluntarily share private, personal information. That's the opposite of what Jews were noted for those days, that they had this respect for privacy. So even though Facebook is a tool, it's an instrument, it's not good or bad, depends how it's used, I think we should learn from this parsha how we should respect the privacy of others, and in order to do that, we should not flaunt our own lives, not talk too much about ourselves, not talk too much about things that are close to us. That doesn't mean we shouldn't communicate happy occasions and things like that. There's a certain balance that is necessary. One of the challenges of life, and of Judaism in particular, is having the right balance. But anyhow, this is what Balak was saying. They cover up the earth. They're not superficial people. They are deep people, and that is something that is intolerable. Now, Bilam, we know, was going with his donkey, and the donkey was going in a narrow area. There was a fence, a wall on each side, and Bilam was being pushed against the wall, which Rashi says was a stone wall, and this injured his leg, and he hit the donkey 3 times. And the fact that Rashi says it was a stone wall, some commentaries point out a very interesting thing. Bilam was related to Lavan. Lavan was Jacob's father-in-law. Some say that Bilam was a son of Lavan. Bilam's father was called Beor, but that's another name for Lavan. Whether it was a father or a grandfather, but he was a descendant of Lavan. When Lavan and Yaakov and Jacob parted ways, in order to prevent trespassing in each person's territory, which was the concern that Lavan had, they built Eid Hagal Hazeh. They built a pile of rocks, of stone, to be a barrier between the two, that you shouldn't infringe on my rights, and I won't infringe on your rights. And Bilam, who violated that stone wall of separation, and was now trying to invade the Jewish people with his curses and harm them, was violating Lavan's promise, which was not just for him, but was for his descendants as well. So how was he punished? That his leg was pushed against the stone wall, that barrier. He was punished by that which he violated. one of the times Balak takes him to a vantage point where it says he was able to see some of the nation, but he couldn't see all of them. Why would he want to go to a place where he could only see some of them and not all of them? So Reb Mendel of Kotsk, the famous Hasidic master, said something very, very powerful. That the only way the Jewish people are vulnerable is when you break them off from one another, when they're not one entity. Because whenever you deal with individuals, there's always imperfection in them. And every imperfection is like an Achilles heel. That is what makes us vulnerable. When we are united, when you can see the whole nation as one entity, the Kotzker said, we are not vulnerable. We don't have to fear the enemy. Because what we lack as individuals, we make up as a group, as one group. Because in every group, there's going to be an individual who has this problem, but it's compensated by someone else who has the opposite of that problem, who's better than average. So as a group, all the good that we have outweighs all the negative. And because of that, we're not vulnerable. So Balak knew that and appreciated that, so he took him to a vantage point where he would see some of the people, hoping that that would make them more vulnerable. Now, Balak complains to Bilam, I took you to curse these people, Lakov, and instead, Barachta Barech, you blessed them. This is in chapter 23, verse 11. And Balak said to Bilam, what have you done to me? To curse my enemy have I brought you, but behold, you have even blessed. Now in Hebrew, the word for to curse is lakov. To bless, or bless, is barech. So one commentary points out something very interesting. This is in the realm of remez, of hints. Our year, lunar calendar, average is 354 days. How do you figure that out? A lunar year is really, a lunar month is 29 and a half days approximately. Since you can't have a month of 29 and a half, we have 6 months that could be 30 days and 6 months that are 29 days. Over some years there are adjustments. You can have more than 6 months with 30. But in a leap year you have a whole 13th month. But in a regular year it's 354. Now of those 354, there are 132 days in which we do not recite the prayer called Tachnun, which is prayer of supplication, of asking God to forgive us for our sins. That is a prayer that we say every weekday, except, we don't say it on Shabbos, of course, we don't say it on any of the Jewish holidays, we don't say it on Rosh Chodesh, the first of the month, or even some of the minor holidays. We don't say it in the entire month of Nisan, we don't say it a good part of the month of Tishrei, and likewise Sivan. So according to one calculation, and there are different opinions about some of these days, there are 132 days when we do not say Tachnun. What does that mean? Those are 132 days in which we are not susceptible to sin. We're protected from sin, because if we're not, we'd have to confess and pray, God, forgive us. The balance is 222 days when we are more vulnerable, and we therefore have to say the prayer called Tachnun. What Bilam was trying to do, Bilam was trying to take the 132 days that we are protected and turn them into negatives. The word lakov, to curse, numerically is 132. So he wanted to turn the 132 blessed days into cursed days. But what happened? It was just the opposite. Barech, the 222 days that are susceptible to curses, they became blessed. and they became positive days. So not only did Bilam not harm the Jews in this effort, he actually helped them and made them even stronger. One final point, we know that Bilam was capable of cursing the Jews, but he didn't curse them. Now, it seems that God just forced him to say the right thing. But the Talmud says that Bilam knew the instant that God gets angry every day. And he was planning on cursing them at that moment. And God didn't get angry all those days. So his curses were meaningless. Now the question is asked, Tosfos, the commentary of the Talmud, asks, if it's only a split second, what could he have possibly said? The second that God gets angry is as long as it takes to say the word second. Rega, 2 syllables. What could he have said to curse them? So one answer is he could have said the word kalein, destroy them, which in Hebrew is only 2 syllables, kalein. That means that one instant could have been catastrophic, which teaches us that one instant of positive energy could be the great salvation. As the Rebbe has always pointed out, that it may take one feather of a mitzvah to tip the scales to bring salvation to the world, to bring Mashiach. Now it's interesting that the word that he could have used was kalein. If you read kalein backwards, it's melech, king. Bilam wanted to do the opposite of bringing royalty to the Jewish people, Mashiach. And interestingly, who was the one who produced Mashiach? It's Moab, it's Balak. So here Bilam was trying to remove that power of royalty that was going to come from Balak by saying kalein, reverse the melech, reverse the power of royalty, but it didn't work. He had to admit that Balak would become the ancestor of the melech, the ultimate king of Mashiach. Today is a very special day. It's the 12th day of Tammuz, the day 90 years ago to the day that the previous Lubavitcher Rebbe was released from exile after he had been released from prison a week and a half before, after his 10-year slave labor was commuted to 3 years of exile, after his death sentence was commuted to 10 years of slave labor. So this is a day that's celebrated by Jews all over the world because the previous Rebbe's salvation represented the miracle, not just for him, but as he wrote in his famous letter, for everyone, including someone whose name Jew was only a nickname. He too, she too, was influenced and liberated by this day. This is a day when we have the power to break out of all limitations and all exiles and all things that inhibit us, that limit our Jewishness. Ultimately, the ultimate barrier that we have to get rid of is the barrier of being in exile with the imminent coming of Mashiach. Have a good night, a happy Yom Tov, happy Yud Beis, Yud Gimel Tammuz, and a good Shabbos. Well,